This video is brought to you by True Tales of Buried Treasure, the largest collection of old treasure magazines in the West. On our website, you can search for individual treasure stories by region, or buy our original magazines themselves. To pay us a visit, please click on the link in the description. Enjoy. In the wide expanse of Montana, there ain't a tale spun more than that of the Lost Keys mine. Over 60 years, I reckon I've heard nigh onto 100 renditions of this here story. But the one that's always held my trust was spun by two full-blooded Indian women, now long gone from this world. If they were still amongst the living, they'd be 130 or more each. One hailed from the Gros Ventre tribe, while t'other was a Sioux. Keys, he drifted into Montana as a surveyor with a U.S. government outfit. Prospecting, though, was his true calling, and he soon parted ways with the government, taking an Indian woman as his bride. On a prospecting jaunt, the couple stumbled upon some fine rock quartz, and they carted off several pounds of it. When the assay came back showing rich veins of gold, Keys was plumb elated. He raked in over $2,000 from the ore he fetched. Straight away, Keys and his woman hightailed it back to the mine, gathering as much ore as their horses could bear. But the Sioux were on the warpath at the time, and they stumbled upon Keys, taking his life without knowing he was wed to an Indian woman. The Sioux, feeling remorseful, lent a hand to the woman, taking her and the horses, and after a spell, returning her to her own Gros Ventre tribe. Not a speck of the ore did they lay a finger on. Word of Keys' find spread like prairie fire, and folks naturally wondered why he never returned with more gold. Then they learned of his untimely end. It seems that much later, a few of these folks had words with Keys' woman. They claimed she never would lead anyone to the mine, for she never wished to set eyes upon it or that part of the country again. Many moons later, it's said she struck a deal to guide some folks to the mine for a hefty sum. But before the journey could commence, she took ill and passed on, a woman well stricken in years by then. Since that time, many a man has squandered his days and dollars in pursuit of the Lost Keys mine. I've heard plenty of tales that struck me as plumb outlandish, and some that still hold water in my mind. The mine was reckoned to be situated north of the Missouri River and south of the Milk River, in the region south of Chinook, Montana. They say the ore was so laden with gold that Keys reckoned he could haul out enough with his team and wagon in 1 or 2 trips to set himself up right. He aimed to stake a gold claim and lease it to a mining outfit he had in mind. But of course, his run-in with them, Sioux put paid to them plans. Back in the winter of 1917, I was working for the B.D. Phillips outfit, tending to 2 flocks of sheep. I mostly bunked with a herder, a fella named Jack McDonald, though folks called him Scotty. Many a night I listened to his yarns about the Lost Keys mine. He was itching to spend more time tracking it down, said he aimed to squirrel away a bit of cash, buy a team and wagon, and head down into that country, camping in different spots and doing a mite of prospecting. Scotty spun tales of working for a cattle outfit back in '76, running cattle on both sides of the Missouri River. Come fall, they aimed to shift a passel of cattle across to the north side. Scotty and a couple other hands were dispatched to gather the cattle as they crossed. He recollected that on the first day's drive away from the river, he was moseying up a coulee with a rock bottom and a few ledges on both sides. He chipped a few rocks from one outcrop, snagged a piece about the size of his fist that felt mighty hefty, and toted it back to camp to show the other cowhands. The other cowhands had themselves a good laugh at Scotty's expense, telling him the land was rife with fool's gold like what he'd picked up. Undeterred, Scotty stowed the rock in his duffel bag and carted it from place to place. In 1916, he sent it off to Helen for an assay, and from that little piece of rock they reckoned there was $17 worth of gold. Come the coming fall, Scotty wanted me to join him on a hunt for the coulee where he'd found the specimen. I took a liking to Scotty. He was easygoing in camp, fine company, and I was certain he came from good stock, so I agreed to tag along with him. Them days, it was customary for herders and ranch hands to mosey into town for a few days off in the spring and fall. Scotty got a hankering for a drink and took off for a few days toward the end of March. Sure enough, he blew through all he had and was mightily riled with himself. He said he'd bumped into Jack McLeod and Sandy McLean, and that he only meant to wet his whistle a mite. But one drink led to another, and he came back plumb broke, without a stitch of new gear. I reassured Scotty, telling him I'd provide the horses, wagon, and all the camping gear we'd need. Come fall, when Scotty herded the lambs to the railroad for shipping, seems he crossed paths with his old friends again. Anyhow, he came back to the ranch penniless, without a winter coat or aught else. I was still keen on outfitting the venture and going prospecting, but Scotty had his pride and wouldn't budge unless he could pay his way. So we put it off time and again. Scotty's health dwindled fast, and afore long he passed on. That spelled the end of our hunt for the Lost Keys mine together. In the fall of 1919, we had loaded out a shipment of cattle to market. The latter part of October, I ran into a man who had just come down from Alaska. He looked to be in his 70s and possibly crowding 80. He said he had been prospecting in Alaska for over 40 years. Before that, he had punched cows. He said in the year 1879 he came up the trail from Texas with a herd of cattle for the Circle Diamond outfit. When he got to the Circle Diamond home ranch, he quit. He didn't say why, other than that he'd had a few words with the boss, who was John's servant at that time. Now this fellow had an interesting story to tell. He'd done a bit of prospecting. He said after they swam the cattle across the Missouri River, he didn't know whether it was the first or second day after the river crossing. They were going up a rock-bottom coulee, and he ran onto some heavy rock. He took 2 pieces of rock with him. When they camped that night, he put the rock in with his clothes. When he quit the Circle Diamond a few days later, he came to Malta, Montana. There he bumped into a man on his way to Alaska to prospect for gold. So he sold his horse and saddle, keeping only his bedroll, and went with him. The 2 partners hit a few spots in Alaska where they made good wages panning. They worked hard at it for several years but couldn't save up anything. Then they heard that several sourdoughs who'd sneaked over into Siberia had come out with a good steak. So they decided to try that, and did quite well on their first trip with what they had to work with. They went back again and were doing very well when the Russians captured them. They were held prisoners for close to 2 years, but this cowpoke's partner was an Englishman, and some of his folks in England had been keeping in contact with him all of the time he was in Alaska. So between his folks and the British government, the Russians were persuaded to release the partners, and they were escorted back to Alaska with just what they had on their backs. They then had to work hard to get a small stake together again. This cowpoke was a Welshman. His name was Ronald Jones, but he was born of Welsh parents. He had been carrying the 2 rocks he'd picked up down in Montana around with him during the first few years they were in Alaska, and had them assayed before they went to Siberia. He was paid over $30 for the gold in those 2 small rocks. As soon as he had that news, Jones wanted to go back to Montana and look for the spot where he'd picked up the rock. But his partner wanted to stay on in Alaska. He said they'd save Montana for their ace in the hole. After they got back to Alaska, Russia, they decided to work until they had enough money to come back and prospect the Montana spot. But Jones's partner had started to lose his health, maybe because of the time they'd spent in prison in Siberia. Jones had quite a time with him for a few years, but he said they'd been together for so long they were closer than brothers, and so he stayed with his partner in Alaska until his death. As I mentioned, Ronald Jones was a weathered soul by the time he shared this tale with me. He recounted how, when toiling for the Circle Diamond outfit, they herded the cattle across the Missouri River at the Rocky Point crossing. He reckoned that if I'd take him to the crossing, he could reckon his bearings and locate the coulee where he'd laid hands on that lucrative float. Jones claimed to have enough coin to see him through a year or so while he sought his fortune, and he aimed to hire me to lead him out yonder. I pledged to supply the wagon, team, and camp gear, and to set out post-haste. It took us a couple of days to gather our camp gear, and then we struck out, making for the old river crossing, where we set up camp for a spell. From the get-go, the old-timer seemed plumb disoriented. We couldn't find no terrain that matched what he'd described to me. We rambled upriver for a day or so, then downriver, setting our sights north toward the foothills of the Little Rockies. We spent more'n 3 weeks trawling the land, but a storm blew in, and we beat a retreat with plans to return once the tempest had passed. But my seasoned companion was slowing down, and his age was working against him. He wasn't in good shape when he made it back home. He hopped on the stagecoach to Malta, saying he'd get himself right and return, and we'd give it another go as soon as he was fit and the weather turned. He lingered in Malta all through the winter, and passed on come the next spring. I never laid eyes on any terrain that resembled what Ronald Jones or Scotty McDonald had described to me. Their tales lined up pretty snug, but prospecting was never my line of work or anywhere near it. That was as close as I ever got to chasing after rocks or quartz of any sort. I had a buddy in Great Falls, Montana, who ran a jewelry store and dabbled in assaying back in the old days. Even after he hung up his hat, folks still brought him ore, and he'd ship it off to Helena for assaying. Normally, it'd take anywhere from 4 to 10 days to receive a report back. Somewhere around 1923, a fella sauntered into my buddy's joint from Chinook, Montana. He claimed to have been tending sheep in the Missouri River breaks and toted 2 different rock samples he'd picked up. He wanted them assayed separately, claiming they were found a good piece apart. Went by the name of James Fletcher, he did, and reckoned he'd be in Great Falls for about a week, promising to swing by and fetch the assayer's report. But to this day, he never made good on his word, and a tidy sum of $37 was gleaned from them 2 samples. I laid eyes on the assay report that trickled back from Helena. I also took a gander at Ronald Jones's report from Alaska of the samples he'd snagged in Montana. Come 1932, I perused the assay report dispatched from Helena for James Fletcher. Since then, I've scoured high and low, inquiring all over the state for a man by that name. But I never stumbled upon his trail, nor found anyone who crossed paths with him. Maybe he didn't cough up his rightful name when he requested the assay. That's the extent of what I know about the Lost Keys mine. I reckon it's been stumbled upon 3 or 4 times, but by sheepherders or cowhands who didn't savvy much about rock sewer, and thus far, none have managed to retrace their steps to the same spot a second time. But I hold firm to the belief that one day, good rock will be unearthed in that neck of the woods. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to read the original article or purchase the magazine from which it was taken, please check out our website, truetalesofburiedtreasure.com.